I'm Reverend Ashley, and a special welcome if this is your first visit to our space. Please ask if you need anything. And also, restrooms are just down the hall, which is also a very important piece of information to have. We are blessed to gather to deepen our understanding today, to draw from the resources and gifts of our congregation as we join in this workshop. Before we feed our minds, we will feed our bodies. So after a prayer, you'll be invited to help yourself to a bowl of soup and drink and bread and dessert if that's how you start your meal. And we will eat and then we will listen. But I am just delighted that you are here and we can experience this time of learning together. So I'll invite Adam to come on up for our prayer.
Let us join our hearts in a spirit of prayer. O Holy One, you have brought us together because we care about your realm, we care about this life and the ways in which we live together. May the food that has been prepared nourish our bodies, and may the discussion and the learning nourish our minds, and may that all nourish our souls so that we may continue to live in faith and as faithful citizens not only of this country but also of your realm. We especially ask that you bless Don as he shares his wisdom with us. But now may your wisdom, which resides in each of our hearts, resonate with the love and the wisdom from on high. We pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Welcome, Mr. Elliott. For your information, we will be recording so that others have the opportunity to watch this later. Well, we are delighted to welcome Donald Elliott to present on legal contexts for controversial claims for presidential powers. Mr. Elliott, a relatively new member of First Church, is a semi-retired environmental lawyer and law professor who has taught at Yale Law School since 1981. He currently teaches one course a year about energy law and policy at Yale in the fall, and a seminar as a distinguished adjunct professor at the Antonin Scalia Law School of George Mason University. Mr. Elliott serves on a variety of advisory boards, primarily in the environmental area. He is an elected member of the American Law Institute and the American College of Environmental Lawyers. He also writes a semi-regular column with the American Spectator. And he is a very busy speaker who travels a lot. He was nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate as General Counsel of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, 1989 to 91, where he met his lovely and brilliant wife, Gail. He practices law part-time as a partner with the Earth and Water Law Group, and he likes to hike and fix things. We welcome you, Mr. Elliott.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be a member of this church. It was a lovely introduction. My father would have been very proud and my mother would have believed it. But it's a great privilege to be here. I thought about two lines that'll be familiar to all of us and Christians. The first was, if I were a shepherd, I would bring a lamb. And this is my lamb. This is what I do. It's not just environmental law, but I've thought about constitutional law, and particularly the constitutional underpinnings of the so-called administrative state. And I've taught that at Yale since 1981. It was actually the subject of my very first tenure piece. I taught it for 10 years at at Georgetown as well. I think what's really important about the presentation today is what I'm not going to talk about. Now, you can talk about anything you want. This is just my rules for me, but I want to be clear what I'm going to talk about and particularly what I'm not going to talk about. What I'm intending to do is to give you some background about the legal structure or the legal context within which some of the present controversies arise, so you can decide for yourself, what you think about it. The other line that I thought about was Daniel in the lion's den, because I am in fact aware of the fact that Connecticut voted 56% for Kamala Harris and only 41% for Donald Trump. So this is not a talk about what we should have done as a country in the last elections. Yeah, I'll speak a little bit more. Okay, good. Thank you very much. And if you have trouble hearing me, which is very rare in my case, but just stick up your hand and it'll remind me. So this is not a talk about Donald Trump and whether or not you agree with him or you don't agree with him. And it's also not about whether the actions that we're talking about are wise as a matter of policy, or whether or not they could have been done in a different way that would have been wiser. I do think those are important topics, and in particular, this represents my views only. It's not an advocacy piece. I'm not trying to advocate one way or the other, but it certainly doesn't reflect the views of either the United Church of Christ or Yale or anybody else. But I've tried to be as honest and straightforward and just share information as I can. My PowerPoint talk by itself goes maybe about 45 minutes. So, feel free as we go along just to interrupt. If you don't understand something, stick up your hand and we stop there. You'll see that this is in sections, and after each section I'm going to invite discussion. And then if we have time at the end, and it probably takes about half an hour, I'm going to give those who have had enough an opportunity to slip out, but then divide the rest of you into discussion groups and have you talk among yourselves. I've been doing this for the last 10 years or so of my classes, and the students love it. They say, I wish Professor Elliott would shut up and let us get into our groups. So it's useful to share ideas with it. But the problem is one that Ashley, as usual, put her finger on when we were talking about this, and you'll see that a number of the things that the Trump administration is doing have been done before and were much less controversial in the past. And so Ashley, with her talent to come to the core of things, said, well, why was it different? And I've got some ideas about that, but I do think it's well worth asking, could they have done things differently? What's really causing the problem? So the first section is a little bit of background. How many of you did the first year of law school? Okay, good. All right, great.
Did the other two also?
Yeah, good. That's good. Well, you'll recognize that you only need the first year. But that is really a way of demonstrating that I'm not wasting time by telling people some of the basic principles that are part of the background that every first-year law student learns. But you need to kind of know some of this stuff in order to understand what's going on. So the first point is that our Constitution really institutionalizes an ongoing struggle for power between Congress and the president. And that was part of the design. They got it from the French guy Montesquieu, but the founders of the Constitution, of whom James Madison is just one, but in the accompanying Federalist, the publications arguing for the ratification, Madison just basically said that the basic design of the Constitution is to have the ambition for power of one branch that holds the ambition for power in the other branch in check. Now, that's different than in some of the other countries. My wife Gail is not here today, not as a protest, but because she's down in Florida where we just bought a house. So she's getting us moved in, and apologizes for not being able to be here. But the Constitution vests the executive power in a single president. There was actually debate about, having three, kind of a committee, and they decided that that wouldn't work well, that you needed, a unitary executive. So people often refer to the unitary executive theory. I've always said it's a fact that that's what they decided. What's controversial are the implications of the decision that you would only have one. And then the Constitution also vests all legislative power in Congress. It doesn't say all executive power, it says all legislative power. So we lawyers get to argue about, what does that mean? But the key thing is it doesn't define either executive power or legislative power. That's kind of left, vague to be worked out later as we go along. And one of the key questions is over this concept of the rule of law. And how you're going to answer that question depends on how you define law.
Again, could you
Yes.
more into the microphone?
All right.
Maybe turning would be easier.
How's that? Better?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try not to wander around and stay fixed. This will work if I keep looking at you, so don't be too put off by that. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different definitions of the rule of law. We often define law in terms of what we think it should be, or what we favor. There's a long tradition of that. I'm trying to be as objective as I can, following this definition from one of my mentors, although I never met the man, that law is a prophecy of what the courts will in fact do. Not necessarily what the outcome would be if we had a different Supreme Court, or if they were mind readers and knew exactly what the framers had in mind, or whatever. But just what is actually objectively likely to happen. Anybody have any questions so far? Okay, good. Another key point, which really goes to the question of, are some of the things that are going on the violation of the rule of law? And this is one that I didn't know about this. I remember it was the very first question in law school, and I got it wrong. So it'll be emblazoned forever in my mind. But anyway, the courts in the United States do not rule on hypothetical questions. These are called advisory opinions. There are a couple of examples. The New Hampshire Supreme Court does give advisory opinions. It seems to work just fine. And there's a more limited example out where I'm from in Indiana, where the Seventh Circuit can ask the Indiana Supreme Court to tell us what the Indiana law on the subject is, and these seem to work fine, but it doesn't work that way at the federal level. So what that means is that if you want to set up a test case, if you want to find out whether or not the court today would still stand behind a precedent from the 1930s, the only way you can get the court to rule on that is you've got to do it, or that's a bit of an exaggeration. You can also threaten to do it. So there are a few cases that say if it's a sufficiently concrete threat, that'll meet the case or controversy requirement. The other really important background principle is that the Supreme Court does not hear the entire case, or at least most of the time it doesn't hear the entire case. Since 1925, it only agrees to hear certain questions of law. So some of the cases that we talk about that have upheld something, they only upheld it with regard to certain issues, not all of the issues that might be presented. So you have to be very careful about it. Now there are some cases, and this is the difference between what's called certiorari or an appeal. And with an appeal, the whole case comes up. With certiorari, which is the more frequent form, the court decides to grant and hear and rule on a particular question. Usually a question where there's been a conflict between the lower courts, so they can't get it straight. So that just is important in terms of what cases mean and what they don't mean. It's also important to know that there is a limit to what lawyers may bring in terms of cases, and these are some of the things that President Trump's former lawyers, such as Rudy Giuliani, have been taken to task for. And basically, a lawyer is not allowed to bring a frivolous case, but under the ABA rule, which, and this part of it is in effect everywhere as far as I know, a case is not frivolous if it includes a good faith argument for an extension, modification, or reversal of existing law. So that means, yeah, go ahead.
What's ABA?
The American Bar Association, I'm sorry. They write model rules that are then adopted. That's a great question. I should have said that. So the point here is that if you want to test whether or not something is still good law, you have to do it and then make an argument. Now, I will tell you, just leaping ahead a little bit, we don't have, that I'm aware of, a final ruling by the courts on any issue regarding the Trump administration yet. We've got a lot of preliminary rulings that maybe are written about in a somewhat confusing way, like saying the court paused it or something like that. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. But a perfect example is this example that I mentioned down here at the bottom. There's an ongoing dispute about whether or not President Trump has the authority to fire the head of the Office of Special Counsel. And that originally went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, we're not going to rule on it because we don't have jurisdiction, or at least we're not going to exercise our jurisdiction because it's just a temporary restraining order. A temporary restraining order is not a decision on the merits. It can actually be granted without the other party getting notice of it. It's called ex parte. It simply says hold everything in abeyance so that we don't have the situation changed in a way that we can't repair later. So that's mostly what's coming up in these in these cases. But a judge did just rule, and it's in the headlines today, so I haven't yet gotten it into the PowerPoint, but it keeps evolving. The judge did rule that on the merits that no, the Trump administration cannot fire the head of this particular agency without making the findings that are required by statute. But the judge also said, if you read down toward the end of the article, that it was an extraordinarily difficult constitutional issue, and that the judge was ruling that way so that there would be a final judgment that could get up to the Supreme Court. So, yeah, that was a federal judge in Washington, D.C. yesterday. So, you know, what we're seeing is that this is playing out in the courts, but it hasn't yet been resolved by the courts. And, you know, there are various predictions that we can talk about as to how it's likely to come out. But that, I think, is what I'm going to talk about. This is just a line that lawyers say to one another. Trump turns lawyers into witnesses or defendants. So you have to be real careful that there's an underlying factual basis if you're going to be representing Trump. Anybody have any questions so far? Okay. There is no question that Trump's record of immediate action upon taking office is really unprecedented. This is a chart that just shows the number of executive orders and other substantive memos and policy changes that Trump has promulgated in the first 100 days. I sometimes thought, somewhat in jest, that maybe every president after the first 4 years ought to have to take 4 years off, think about what they did wrong, and then they could run again. But clearly they have spent a lot of time, you know, thinking about what they're doing. And I think part of the reason that some of this may be so controversial is there's kind of like a blur. The other thing that has happened in recent years, and this is a chart that comes from the Harvard Law Review, the number of injunctions against policies, presidential policies going into effect, almost exclusively judges appointed by the opposition political party. Didn't used to be that way. It used to be that the only judges that could issue nationwide injunctions were in the District of Columbia, and they were actually appointed by the president and had more of a national view. Today, and it's something that pretty much everybody agrees is a big problem, whether they're on the left or the right, is nationwide injunctions. So now you can kind of pick a judge based on their past record, and pick the judge that's most likely to be favorable to your point of view, and at least get a preliminary ruling in your favor, and then that's going to be appealed to an appellate court and eventually to the Supreme Court. But we're not there yet. We're just really beginning. So you can see that some people believe that Trump's actions have created a constitutional crisis. This article, actually, if you read it, has the law professors divided 2 to 2. The two who think it's a constitutional crisis, one of them was a former student of mine, who's quite a good student, Pam Carlin, who now teaches at a place in California. Another is also a California lawyer. So, we're seeing some really inflammatory rhetoric that we're in the middle of a constitutional crisis, whatever that means. One of my colleagues at Yale, Bruce Ackerman, has a different, pardon me?
I said bingo.
Yeah, okay, bingo.
Sorry.
Okay, what's the word? No, sorry. Yeah, one of my colleagues at Yale, Bruce Ackerman, has proposed an alternative approach, which he calls constitutional moments. And he first proposed this in a lecture at Yale in 1983, published in 1984. And basically the argument is that the Constitution changes not only when we have a formal amendment to the Constitution that's written down, but if somebody asserts the power to do something, and then over time people accept it, then it becomes legitimate whether or not it's actually changed the word of the Constitution. I remember when I heard that, I thought, this is crazy, this can't be right. But Bruce has really expanded it into a massive 3-volume constitutional history of the Constitution. He gives lots of examples, like the Civil Rights Movement, which Reverend Lashley was talking about this morning, where things changed and what had been the law at one time, like that African Americans are property or can be property, or that it's okay to keep them separate as long as they're separate but equal, that those ideas changed over time as attitudes of the people. So the theory emphasizes the first words of the Constitution, we the people. The claim that what really makes the law is what the people are willing to accept or not accept. And I'll go back one. Bruce's primary example of it is the creation of the so-called administrative state in the New Deal. And then he's gone on to discover there are a number of other constitutional moments. And what's fascinating about it is that this seems to be a phenomenon not just in the U.S. but worldwide. Lots of people elsewhere in the world think that the law works this way too. It's not necessarily a normative theory. It's a theory just of how things work. But we might like it better if everybody. It would certainly make the job of lawyers easier if everybody, when they wanted to change the Constitution, went through the wording changes. But in any event, just an alternative way of looking at it. Here's what I propose to discuss, 6 different examples of controversial claims of presidential power. you can see what they are. I hate it when people read me what's on the PowerPoint, so I try. You can read, and I'm happy to talk about any others that you come up with. Anyone else that people want to add right now? Okay, seeing none, we can always add one as we go on, but let me just run through them pretty quickly. So probably the place where there's been the most real action over the last 10, 15 years is with regard to the presidential power to both hire and fire other officers in the executive branch. And it's becoming clear that there are 3 different levels of federal employees, and then some subsets within them. You have officers of the United States who can be appointed by the president or with the advice and consent of the Senate or the heads of departments. You have inferior officers of the United States who are defined as somebody who reports to an officer of the United States. And then you also have employees, okay? So you can look at what the language says, but you either are appointed by advice and consent of the Senate, which I was as general counsel of EPA, or you can be an inferior officer that can be appointed by the president, by the courts of law, or the heads of departments. So, if you're an assistant secretary, you can be appointed not by the president, but by your head. And that's just what the Constitution says. Yeah. Yes, please. Okay. Will do.
Every time you move that way.
Yeah, I know.
Let's see, we might have
If you want, let's see if this works.
There we go.
So I'm seeing if the battery is working.
Okay. I'll be good, I
let's
promise.
Testing.
Mute is on the back.
What?
Mute is on the back.
Mute is on the back. Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Let me just stick with this, I'll be good.
Okay. Let me just. 10.2. That's not working. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll stick with that.
I have a quick question.
Please.
Where do the higher military officers fit in that?
They're officers of the United States.
Okay, thank you.
So that's why a president can assert the power to fire the head of the Joint Chiefs,
Right, thank you.
because they serve at the power of the president. So that may
These things
be,
are working now, so you can use this if you want to.
okay. Do you think that's better?
Well, let's try it for a second.
Okay. Following.
I can turn it up a little bit more.
Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Is that better? Okay. Okay, good. So this is an area where the law has changed, and currently people are asserting that there should be a change back to what the law used to be. Okay. That's a pattern that we'll see in a number of these areas, but it's pretty clear that the original understanding from the foundation of the Constitution and its ratification in 1789, at least through the early part of the 20th century, was that the president had very broad powers to hire and fire the officers of the United States, so the top people, policy-making positions. And that was indicated, among other things, in a 1871 Attorney General's opinion. Now, Attorney Generals are notoriously advocates for presidential power, so you have to take their opinions with, kind of a grain of salt, because they tend to be advocacy. But then there was a famous case that we talk in administrative law called Myers versus the United States in 1926, which held unconstitutional a statute requiring the Senate to advise and consent to the firing of a local postmaster. So an inferior officer of the United States, the head postal guy in an area, but that was the main source of political patronage in that era, so it's not that trivial. And there was a very broad opinion written by Chief Justice Taft, the only example of a president who then became Chief Justice. So by the time he was Chief Justice, after he was president, he had a very commodious view of what the powers of the president would be, and he wrote an 8-to-1 decision. The only one who dissented was Chief Justice Brandeis. So, you know, you have a period up until 1926, or up until really the New Deal, in which presidents had broad authority to hire and fire. That began to erode with the development of the civil service system in 1883, although people that have studied that more than I have say it was really a way of ending the political patronage in hiring. It wasn't intended to insulate people from being fired if they were unsatisfactory. The major case, which is much debated and we'll talk about, is called Humphrey's Executor in 1935. And what it said was that despite it did what we lawyers call distinguished, created a difference. It said, oh, this case isn't governed by Myers after all, because what's different about Humphrey's Executor? Well, it said that in those agencies with, quote, quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial functions, that if Congress wanted to, it could enact what's called for-cause firing by statute for the heads of agencies. So it would say, the president can only fire the head of this agency for gross dereliction of duty, or whatever they say. We don't know very much about that because Congress exercised that authority very, very rarely. But that's the issue that's being now debated, and I think it's very likely to go to the Supreme Court, and there'll be some change. I'll explain this in a minute. The notion of for-cause firing was reiterated in a case about independent counsel in 1988 called Morrison versus Olson, but I don't place a lot of stead by that, because if I were to go back to the language, the Constitution specifically says that officers can be appointed by the president or the courts. So, you know, that's not a big issue. Yeah.
In Musk's case, does he have the power by the president, from the president, to do the things he's doing?
We're going to get to that. That's my next topic. So first, we're going to talk about what the president has, but we will talk about that, and that's a very important point. The answer to your question is no. He does not have the authority to do anything other than make recommendations and have access to data, but we'll get to that. Okay.
I'm just going to try.
Okay. So this is one of my favorite lines about how law works. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was a polymath. He wrote symphonies and did a whole bunch of other stuff. But I think this is right, that what I see frequently is you have a reform and it gets carried too far and the other side, you know, pushes back. So we're going to see that dynamic happen repeatedly here, and I think the hiring and firing of officials is particularly one good place. So what we had was very broad powers up until like 1920, 1930, and then an exception is created in Humphrey's Executor in 1935. What that was about was the head of the Federal Trade Commission was a conservative Republican, and here's Roosevelt in the midst of the Great Depression, and he's trying to put in place an economic policy, and this guy who's the head of the Federal Trade Commission is, you know, frustrating his every move. So was sort of an extreme version, very different than the postmaster first class, so it goes to the Supreme Court, and they say quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial. What does quasi mean? Well, I say to my classes, it means it isn't, but we're going to pretend it is. I mean, basically, every agency in Washington these days would have some quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial functions. So if they do any rulemaking, that's a quasi-legislative function. If they do any adjudication, that's a quasi-judicial function. Those are the only two categories of agency action that are in the Administrative Procedure Act. So, you know, it's pretty much everything. Now, it didn't say the officer with the quasi-judicial function, right? And I was talking to a friend of mine who, he and I disagree on a lot of things, but we both agree it's a very different case if it's just that officer that has certain kinds of activities. But if the whole agency or the head of the agency is immune because you've got an administrative law judge somewhere in the agency, that's really very different. And there's an even broader category. This is from the letter. My wife serves on the Kennedy Center board, And, you know, the president recently fired the members of the board, and you can read what she says is basically there's nothing in the law that would prevent it, but it hasn't been done. A lot of what you see objected to, including some of the firings of the Kennedy Center Board and of lawyers in the Southern District of New York, is not illegal per se. It's just by tradition it hasn't been done. That people in the past have, you know, respected it, but it's not a legal issue. It's more of an issue of tradition. Okay, so what has happened in the last few years, and it's not just under Trump, you can see the first case and still the lead case is this Freed Enterprise Fund case in 2010, which basically held that for inferior officers, that is officers that are appointed by others, you could not by statute say the president couldn't fire them, right? So that was a 5-4 decision in 2010. Since that time, there are two other laws that have subsequently been held unconstitutional under Humphrey's executor. So what you're seeing is a gradual narrowing of Humphrey's executor from a very broad principle to a more narrow one. I think the question is likely whether or not there are 5 votes to overrule Humphrey's executor, you know, like they did with Chevron, or whether or not they do a little narrowing of it or clarification of it. I think there are already 3 conservatives on the Supreme Court who've said they're in favor of getting rid of it, and it will turn on whether or not, you know, Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett Brown are willing to go along or not to get to 5. The most important thing anybody ever said to me about the Supreme Court, and alas, it was said to me by a fellow who now teaches at Harvard Law School, Richard Lazarus, but he said the most important thing about the Supreme Court is learning to count to 5. And, you know, okay. So that's what's going on that front. As I've said, Humphrey's executor is likely to be up for consideration. One of my students, Sai Prakash, who teaches at University of Virginia, with a co-author, wrote this 88-page article in the Harvard Law Review, reviewing all of the law about it. And then some other folks wrote a 30-page article rebutting their article. So, you know, if you want to read more about it, that's how to do it. And when you see these links like this in this color, that means it's live links. So if you get the PowerPoint, you should be able to click on that and go right to the document if you want to read more about it. But what Sai and his co-author conclude is that this whole issue of the ability of the president to fire people in the executive branch is really one of the oldest ongoing debates about the Constitution. What is new, however, is the development of public employees unions. Until JFK, I didn't know this and I didn't put it on here, but Roosevelt and all of the Democrat presidents up to and including JFK should never say have collective bargaining with public employees unions until that time, and then this all switched in 1970 under JFK. Right before the inauguration, the Trump employee who is the head of a department signed a union contract giving 42,000 Social Security employees the right to work remotely until 2029. I just figured out, it took me a little while, that this is, you know, through the next president's term. Normally they're not allowed to do this, but with a contract, there is an old case that contracts can be binding on the federal government. So there's a debate about the extent to which these contracts are valid or not, and I've seen some things that the Trump administration may challenge some of them. The Trump administration attempted to expand the number of senior career employees that would be subject to firing. This was actually an idea that was created under Jimmy Carter in 1978, called the Senior Executive Service, and people get promoted to They get a big raise in pay, they get more authority, but they serve kind of between the political appointees and the career staff. And it's voluntary. Trump proposed in his first term to expand that limitation on their civil service protection to all policy influencing employees. So I guess that would be about 90% of people in the government. I mean, everybody in the government, in my experience, really thinks they are influencing policy, and they are. That executive order was immediately revoked by Biden in 2021 when he came in. And of course, on his first day in office, Trump revoked the revocation to sort of try and put it back in effect. And there are now bills pending in Congress to both codify it and to make it illegal. And everybody's marching off to court. So that's where that stands. Anybody have any questions about this whole, or comments about this whole unit so far? Okay. Next topic. Buyouts.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Where does that five-star general come
Well, he is an
in? Which one of those things?
He's an officer of the United States,
Correct.
so he can be fired at will by the president.
At will.
And there's nothing in the statute that limits the grounds on which he could be fired. So if there were something in the statute, which there isn't,
Okay.
then there might be a new case about it. There aren't very many places where Congress has limited the grounds on which somebody is fired. The biggest example of them that the Supreme Court seems most concerned about is the Federal Reserve Board. So that Federal Reserve Board, because they don't want to see that become under the policy control of the president to be able to, get the economy jacked up when, right before elections or things like that. Okay, anything else? Great. Buyouts of employees who don't want to go back to the office. You can see very clear, I think, that they have statutory authority to do this, not necessarily a wise way to do it. Very common in the private sector, offer somebody, 7 months or whatever it is of salary without working. There is some risk that they could resign and not get paid. I think that's a theoretical risk given the control of Congress, but we'll have to wait and see. But I think the American Federation of Government Employees is correct that they might not get paid. So 75,000, or about 3% of federal workers, accepted the buyouts voluntarily. So those are people that are not going to be fired because they already took a golden parachute or whatever. I just thought it was very entertaining that Reuters said this will only save less than $10 billion a year. So it reminds me of a line, I think it was years ago, Everett Dirksen said, "1 million here and 1 million there," and pretty soon we're talking about real money. So 10 billion here and 10 billion there, pretty soon it really adds up. But yeah, no, I think there is some risk there, but not very much really. Okay, so this is the question I was asked earlier.
What is
Yeah.
the total budget right now? Like, what is 10 billion relative to? Because I have no frame of reference for that. I've heard
Yeah.
the number a million times, and it drops out of my head.
Well, round numbers, we take in about $4 trillion a year. We run a $2 trillion deficit, or 1.8 and change. So about $6 trillion, of which we are only funding $4 billion, and so we add $2 trillion every year. We're now up to 38 or 39 trillion. And one of the problems, I think, and I'm glad you asked it, is this is just so hard for people to get their mind around. What does it mean? And is it really going to have these terrible consequences? Because you see the pain of the individual employee who's got laid off. You don't see what happens to the country, if we don't find some way to try to get the spending under control. And I've written a bunch of things about that. So whether or not DOGE is legal depends on whether or not they're only recommendations to somebody with legal authority to do it, and that applies both to cuts in personnel and spending. And it's also not legitimate to give them access to sensitive personal information if it's not necessary for their work. If it's necessary for their work, it is, because he is what's called a special government employee, which is a long-standing category. And they often use that for advisors. Like when I'd go to an administrative conference meeting, they would appoint me as a special government employee for the day, and then certain requirements apply to you. Yes?
So how would, since they're not given access to sensitive personal information, not necessary for the work, where does getting everybody's social security and personal information fall in that realm?
On my next slide. I didn't really put her up to it, but yeah, no, I agree. That's a key issue. So this chart on the left is from Musk's Twitter file, X file. And he says, and I don't know that this is true, but he says that this is from Social Security information, that this is their database, and they've summarized it into a chart. And if you look at where I put that bracket on the side, it does look like upwards of 20 million people are supposedly over 100 years old and continuing to get Social Security payments. Now, you know, that's what he says. I don't know if it's right or not. Yeah, and then here.
What I understand is that those numbers are in the database, but there's no indication that those numbers are actually receiving.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And so that's what they're supposedly investigating. So the question is, why do they need access to people's Social Security numbers? Because lots of the Social Security numbers look suspicious, and you can investigate it and figure out whether they are or not. What's been said on the other side, and you can read it, but this is the CNN story, where he basically demands that Elon Musk show me the 12 people that are 150 years old, right? Yeah. Well, you know, he can't show them the 12 people unless they, you know, investigate it. But I think this is a very interesting example of our politics and the way in which these visual events seem to get emblazoned in our mind about, you know, some 19-year-old is going to have access to your Social Security number, you know, and people are really scared about that. This is kind of like Reagan talking about, you know, this woman who was on a welfare Cadillac or whatever. You know, these are sort of these episodic events that sort of speak volumes to people. But anyway, I don't know. I think I don't know enough to know whether or not it's legitimate for them to be able to check this out or not. Usually, we have a pretty low standard for that. There is a Supreme Court case